In the late hours when the world sinks into its gentler breath and the voices of the day loosen their hold, there is a narrow passage between waking and forgetting where old histories stir again. Travel with me into that passage, into the twilight of forgotten lives, where figures who once walked the earth return not in flesh but in the hush of memory. I speak softly now, as one might when entering a dim chapel or an abandoned gallery where the dust carries its own faint scripture. The past does not rise with clarity. It drifts toward us like a slow tide, revealing shapes, then withdrawing them, leaving only traces for the patient eye. It is in this pale light that the life of a small girl from 17th century Spain begins to reappear. She does not come forward as a full being at first. She emerges as a silhouette, then the outline of a child framed in cloth, then the heavy silence of a story recorded only in fragments. Her name was Eugenia Martínez. The world knew her for a moment, then lost her almost entirely, preserving not her words nor her breath, but an image. A painting that survived longer than the memory of her voice, a portrait that traveled farther than the child ever could. And from this image grew a legend, not because it was the truth of who she was, but because it was the only part of her that time refused to surrender. Across centuries, the canvas hardened into her identity, and the girl beneath it faded. This is the paradox that opens her story. A life observed yet never understood. A life displayed yet never heard. A life remembered only by those who looked upon her as something to behold rather than someone to know. Tonight we walk toward her with gentler steps. We move through the corridors of history as one moves through a sleeping house, careful not to disturb what rests, but curious enough to open doors that have not been touched in years. The 17th century does not greet us with hospitality. It holds itself close, wrapped in the scent of old stone, cold iron, and candle smoke. Spain, at this time, was an empire in the slow exhale of fatigue, its glory dimming, its power softening, its court drifting through rituals that masked a deeper uncertainty. Yet, within these halls, grandeur continued to perform itself with velvet, gold thread, and quiet ceremony. And into this world, a child born far from the palace would one day be brought, her presence unsettling in its innocence and its unfamiliar form. Before we know her story, we must first feel the world into which she arrived. A world where the unknown could draw fear as easily as fascination. A world ruled by superstition as steadily as by the monarchy. A world where the body was not only flesh but symbol, omen, or curiosity. When Eugenia was carried into being in 1674, in a village of Cantabria, where the mountains stand like old guardians against the northern wind, the shape of her body startled those around her. Not because she was malformed, but because she was abundant, heavy with a fullness that no infant should possess. Her limbs swelled with an unusual weight, her face rounded beyond the proportions of a newborn. In an age without the language of modern diagnosis, such a condition invited myth before understanding. The villagers whispered their explanations quietly. Some spoke of omens, some of divine will, some of unexplained humors, yet the child breathed. She looked. She responded with the fragile insistence of all living beings. Whatever mystery clung to her form, life persisted beneath it. We return now to the faint image of the silhouette, the child half in shadow. She did not yet bear the name by which she would be remembered. That would come later, bestowed not by family nor by kindness, but by the world beyond her mountain home. But even in these earliest moments, when she lay wrapped in cloth within her mother's arms, something had already begun. A quiet hinge in her fate had turned. The world had stepped closer, leaning in not with affection but with a strange curiosity that would follow her from cradle to court. And so the story opens with a soft tension. A child who never asked to be anything but alive was slowly being woven into something else, something larger than herself, something that would define her long after she was gone. Now imagine a small chamber lit by candlelight. A chronicler in the service of the crown bends over a page, writing down the rumors that travel through the kingdom. He listens to tales carried from distant provinces, classifies them, dismisses many, but pauses at the mention of an extraordinary child. Not extraordinary in talent or destiny, but in form. A child whose size and presence defy expectation. In this candlelit moment, when ink meets parchment, history takes its first step toward binding her. Such records, though brief, traveled quickly to the court of King Charles II, a monarch whose own body was a source of mystery and whose reign seemed shaped by forces both physical and invisible. A court accustomed to anomalies, omens, and superstitions became increasingly fascinated by the existence of a young girl whose condition could not be explained. This fascination would one day pull her from her home and place her under the gaze of nobles, physicians, and artists, but we are not there yet. For now, she remains a child in the mountains, wrapped in the rhythms of a life far removed from the echoing floors of royal chambers. Time in such places moves differently. Seasons speak louder than politics. The everyday breath of the village shapes the earliest understanding of the world. And in this slower world, the girl who would become a symbol was still nothing more than a presence in her family's household. We do not know her voice. We do not know her first words, her laughter, her cries. The records do not speak of them. They were sounds meant for the ears of those who loved her and were lost the moment they faded into the air. But the image of her form traveled farther than the sound of her childhood. That is the beginning of her silence, the silence that history preserved. It is important now to understand the quiet strangeness of this beginning. Eugenia lived in a world where fate could be rewritten not through actions but through appearance. A world where the body was not a private truth but a public text. A world ready to project its fears and curiosities onto those whose bodies defied familiar boundaries. And so her first steps, her first attempts to navigate the world, occurred under a weight she could not name, a weight placed not by illness alone, but by interpretation. As we walk deeper into her story, the atmosphere changes. The twilight thickens. The corridor narrows. The sound grows softer until only one detail remains, the one that will lead us into the next stage of her life. Picture a brush dipped in pigment. A single stroke beginning on a blank canvas in a studio in Madrid. The gesture is slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, as if the painter knows that what he captures will outlive not only himself, but the quiet girl who will stand before him. That first stroke hangs in the stillness, suspended between creation and memory. And it is there, in the faint echo of that brush upon canvas, that part one must leave you, standing before the threshold of a life about to be taken from its origins and placed beneath the unblinking gaze of history. The faint echo of the brush upon canvas lingers as though suspended in the air between centuries, guiding us into the next movement of her story, a quiet doorway from the mountains of her birth to the chambers where her image would be fixed forever. That soft sound becomes the bridge between origin and recognition, and through it we return to the beginning, to the moment when the world first tried to name her. The girl was born in a landscape shaped by wind and stone, a land where the mountains rise like ancient guardians and the people live close to the rhythms of the earth. In such places, the extraordinary is not often welcomed, for it bends the order of familiar life. From her earliest days, the weight of Eugenia's body startled those who held her, not only for its size, but for the intensity with which it seemed to defy the fragility of infancy. The villagers who saw her whispered quietly among themselves, unsure of what such a form could mean. In the 17th century, the unknown carried an air of superstition that seeped into the smallest corners of rural life. A child who did not resemble other children could stir the imagination toward fear or wonder, and both emotions found their way into the murmured stories about her. Yet within the home where she was cradled, she was simply a daughter. Families in remote regions held their love tightly, shaping it around whatever circumstances fate delivered. They understood that the world beyond their doorstep might not see her with the same gentle eyes. Still, they could not know how far their daughter's image would travel, nor how deeply her form would imprint itself on the imagination of people she would never meet. Her earliest years slipped by with few records, for the lives of the poor rarely left written traces. Time passed as it does in small villages, measured not by royal decrees but by the turning of seasons, the call of market days, the sound of bells marking the hours. Eugenia's childhood might have continued this way, quietly and without intrusion, had the curiosity of the wider world not reached her. But news travels in subtle ways. A visitor, a merchant, a wandering official might bring word of unusual events to places where such stories rarely arrived. And so, in the mouth of a stranger or in the ink strokes of a traveling chronicler, the tale of a child whose size defied nature slowly made its way toward the royal court. At that time, King Charles II presided over a kingdom where the boundaries between science and superstition blurred easily. His court, burdened by the weight of religious omens, political uncertainty, and the heavy expectations of dynastic survival, had become a place where anomalies were both feared and sought after. To the curious minds of the palace, the existence of an extraordinary child in a remote province was not merely a matter of human interest, but a sign, a phenomenon that demanded examination. Thus began the transformation of Eugenia from child to spectacle, from daughter to curiosity. The act of naming her was the act that set this transformation in motion. The court chroniclers, accustomed to cataloging strange occurrences, gave her a label that history would repeat long after her death. They called her La Monstrua. The word fell onto the page with a finality that mirrored the attitude of the era, a term intended not as cruelty but as classification, a way to mark her as something beyond ordinary life. Yet such a name, once written, becomes a weight. It travels, it echoes, it shapes perception, and soon the people who spoke of her would do so not with her given name but with the one imposed by those who had never met her. In this moment, her identity began to shift away from her own being and toward the world's interpretation of her. The name carried a shadow that grew larger as it moved toward the court. It followed her through the corridors of the palace. When she was eventually brought there, a small child presented before nobles, whose eyes reflected astonishment more than empathy. The first impressions she made in those gilded rooms would define her image in the years that followed. To the courtiers who saw her, she represented a physical mystery, a living embodiment of the unusual. They did not yet see her as a child with thoughts or fears, desires or discomforts. They saw only what her body revealed at a glance, and that was enough for them to give her a place in the catalogue of the extraordinary. There is a quiet loneliness in such beginnings. Imagine the young Eugenia standing in a room where the marble floors echo each movement, where strangers gaze at her with an intensity she cannot understand. She does not speak. She does not protest. She simply exists beneath their scrutiny, absorbing the weight of their fascination without knowing its cost. The court physicians examined her. The officials recorded her presence. The nobles whispered as she passed. And above all of them floated the label that had been given to her, a word that preceded her steps, La Monstrua. This name, once spoken, signaled the start of her life as an object of attention. Her journey into the palace marked the beginning of a new identity, one crafted by others and placed upon her without her consent. Yet even within this transformation, her own presence persisted quietly. Beneath the layers of interpretation, she remained a child, breathing gently in the guarded rooms, her innocence intact despite the gaze of those who saw her only as symbol. And so her story moves forward, carried by the soft sound that guided us here. The brushstroke that echoed at the end of the previous part now presses more firmly against the canvas as the painter prepares to capture her likeness. But before the portrait is completed, another detail lingers in the air. A faint image of a court page staring at the child with a look of confusion, curiosity, and something unspoken. His gaze, suspended between understanding and bewilderment, opens the next door in her story. It is with that gaze, uncertain and searching, that this part must leave you, holding the weight of the name given to her and the mystery of the life that now begins to unfold beneath it. The gaze of the young page holds steady for a moment longer, suspended in the dim corridors of the palace, as though he were trying to understand something that language has not yet offered him. That look, fragile and unformed, becomes the thread that draws us deeper into her unfolding life, guiding us toward the first lesson that shaped her path. It is not a lesson she was taught through words. It is one she absorbed through the silence surrounding her, through the weight of eyes that lingered too long, and through the uneasy hush that accompanied her steps. In the palace, she learned early what many spend their lives resisting, that a person can be seen long before they are understood. The recognition she received was not warm, nor was it cruel. It was simply the curiosity of a world that had no language to describe her, and thus reduced her to an object of fascination. To be observed so intently without being addressed is a peculiar loneliness. Eugenia moved through a place where everything spoke except those who should have spoken to her. The tapestries told stories, the walls echoed footsteps, the courtiers whispered to one another, but rarely did they speak to the child herself. They spoke around her, about her, as though she were both present and absent, visible yet unreachable. This is the environment in which her first lesson took form. She began to understand, in the quiet stillness of her own awareness, that the world was not reacting to her but to the idea of her. Her body entered a room before she did, shaping every interaction, defining every response. Though she could not articulate it, she perceived that the people who surrounded her were interpreting her existence rather than encountering her being. Such a lesson, learned so young, leaves an imprint that does not fade. The courtiers, accustomed to categorizing the unusual, saw her as a living curiosity. Scholars speculated about her condition. Physicians examined her with a mixture of professional detachment and subdued astonishment. Servants watched her with wide eyes, unsure of whether to approach or withdraw. And through it all, Eugenia remained silent, her thoughts unrecorded, her feelings unwritten. Yet silence does not imply absence. Within that silence, something was forming. She was learning that identity could be shaped externally, that the meanings others imposed could drown the truth of a person's inner life. She was learning that the world could define her before she had the chance to define herself. This understanding, though heavy for a child, became the foundation upon which the rest of her life would be built. The palace was not an unkind place, but it was a place where people were observed for their value to the court, for their ability to entertain, to intrigue, to serve as symbols. Eugenia's presence fulfilled a need, though she could not have known it. In a time when omens were studied and anomalies recorded, she became a living sign, a point of fascination that momentarily captured the attention of those who otherwise drifted through routines, thick with ceremony and expectation. But fascination carries its own cost. When a person becomes a symbol, their humanity risks dissolving into the background of the symbol's meaning. Eugenia would never have the chance to reclaim her voice within these halls. She would never be given the opportunity to express the inner landscape of her thoughts. Instead, she learned that the world could gaze at her intensely while never truly seeing her at all. The first lesson was not spoken, it was lived. And it shaped how she moved through the palace, her steps quiet, her presence observed but never known. We linger for a moment in the dim chamber where she often sat, a small figure surrounded by the opulence of a court that could not fathom her simplicity. The thick curtains muted the outside world, the heavy air pressed gently around her, and the flickering light of candles cast shifting shadows across the floor. In these spaces, she sensed the murmuring voices that arose whenever she entered a room, voices that debated what she represented rather than who she was. These murmurs filled the air like a persistent echo, and it is this echo that carries us to the turning point of this part. The echo grows, not in volume but in presence, becoming the sound that defines her early years in the palace. It follows her through the hallways, through the courtyards, through the rooms where nobles gather. It settles in her awareness as though it were part of the air she breathed. And one day, as she is led into a chamber where the light spills softly over carved wooden panels, the echo becomes something else. it becomes the sound of a decision being made about her fate. A painter has been summoned. Juan Carreño de Miranda, the court artist, known for his skill in capturing the subtleties of presence and form. He approaches her slowly, with an expression not of fear but of intent curiosity. He studies her with the eyes of someone who seeks to understand through observation. Yet even he, despite his sensitivity, cannot escape the role he has been assigned. He will paint her not as a child but as a symbol, though he may sense the quiet being beneath the surface. The first lesson deepens in this moment. Eugenia realizes in her own wordless way that she is to become an image, something fixed and permanent. A portrait will outlive her thoughts, her breath, her fleeting joys and discomforts. The world will one day know her through this painting, and through it alone. The painter lifts his brush. The murmuring voices in the hallway soften. The light bends gently across her face, and with the first stroke, her transformation into a figure of history begins. That soft sound of voices, the ones that filled her early palace days, fades into a quieter murmur now, settling at the edge of hearing. It is with that lingering murmur, the blend of curiosity and misunderstanding that shaped her earliest lesson, that we leave her for the moment, standing at the threshold of the life that is about to unfold through the artist's hand. The murmuring that once drifted through the corridors now settles into a deeper, more resonant presence, as though the walls themselves carry the memory of those early impressions. This softened sound guides us into the next ascent of her life, the moment when the quiet child from Cantabria reached the strange summit of her visibility. It is not the summit of achievement or influence in the way history often measures such things, for Eugenia's life moved along a different axis. Her rise was defined not by triumph but by attention, not by her actions but by the way the world saw her. And so the voices that once whispered in uncertainty now swell into the orderly hum of the royal court as it prepares to place her before eyes far more discerning than those of the servants who first observed her. The chamber where Juan Carreño de Miranda worked was unlike the spaces where Eugenia spent most of her days. It held a softer, quiet, the kind shaped by concentration rather than neglect. Here, silence was the painter's companion, a presence that allowed him to listen more closely to the forms he sought to capture. When Eugenia was brought into this room, the air shifted slightly, as though even the dust understood that something unusual had entered. The painter studied her not as a curiosity but as a subject, and though the distinction was subtle, it offered her a momentary reprieve from the gaze she had grown accustomed to. Still, he was part of the court, part of the world that viewed her as a symbol, and no amount of artistic sensitivity could free him from the expectations placed upon his craft. He observed her posture, the weight of her limbs, the proportions that set her apart. He considered the clothing she was to wear, garments chosen not to comfort her but to emphasize what the court wished to display. Her first portrait depicted her richly dressed, adorned in fine fabrics that contrasted sharply with the simplicity of her origins. She stood not as the child she was but as a figure shaped by the imagination of others. The painter's brush moved with deliberate precision, translating her presence into form and shadow, color and contour. Each stroke contributed to the image that would become her legacy, an image that would speak for her long after her own voice fell silent. As the painting neared completion, the court buzzed with anticipation. Nobles gathered to witness the unveiling, eager to see how the painter had rendered the child who had stirred their curiosity. In their eyes, she was not a girl but an emblem of rarity, something to be marveled at and discussed. They viewed her portrait with the same interest they gave to exotic animals or unusual artifacts brought to the court from distant lands. This was the height of her visibility, the moment when she stood at the center of attention, though not by choice. Her summit was constructed by the gaze of others, elevated by circumstances beyond her understanding. Yet, even in this moment of prominence, her inner world remained hidden. The court saw her through a narrow lens, one shaped by fascination rather than empathy. They admired the painting, commented on its accuracy, debated the meaning of her condition, but none of them asked who she was beneath the surface of her body. The portrait captured her form with striking detail, but it could not convey her quietness, her unspoken questions, the subtle ways she reacted to the spaces around her. When the second portrait was commissioned, the transformation was even more pronounced. This time she was dressed in a theatrical costume, an outfit designed to deepen the impression of spectacle. The image it created was powerful, unsettling, and enduring, but it nudged her further away from her own truth. The child beneath the costume was swallowed by the symbol she was forced to embody. This second painting became an emblem of the court's desire to frame her as something beyond human. The summit thus reached was not one of dignity or self-realization, but a height built from the world's projections. Still, within that height, there is a quiet element worth noticing. The painter himself paused often as he worked, not out of hesitation but out of a subtle sense of responsibility. He was aware that these paintings would outlast the fleeting curiosity of the court. He knew that long after the king, the nobles, and the murmuring servants had disappeared, these portraits would remain as the only testimony to the girl's existence. And perhaps in those pauses, he wondered what her life might be beyond the confines of the canvas. When he stepped back from the finished work, there was a moment in which he regarded the painted figure with a stillness that echoed something deeper than artistic pride. He saw the image he had created, and he saw the child who had stood before him. And in that small space between the two, there was a silence filled with questions he did not have the language to ask. It is in this moment that her summit quietly dissolves. The painter lowers his brush, the court begins to drift away, and Eugenia is left standing in the fading light of the studio, unaware of how fully her likeness will shape her fate. The air settles, the murmurs fall into a distant hum, and the only sound that remains is the faint scrape of the painter's chair against the floor as he steps backward to view the completed portrait. That gesture, slow and deliberate, becomes the final image of this part, a gentle movement that marks the threshold between her rise as a spectacle and the deeper meaning that the world would later assign to her form. The faint scrape of the painter's chair recedes into the quiet of the studio, leaving behind an image suspended between life and representation, between the warm breath of the child who stood before the canvas and the cool permanence of the figure now trapped within its borders. That chair, still angled slightly to one side as though the painter might return at any moment to make one final adjustment, becomes the doorway into the next movement of her story, the movement in which Eugenia transforms from a presence into a symbol. The shift is subtle at first. A court attendant enters the room and pauses before the finished portrait. He sees not the effort of the painter, nor the fatigue of the child who posed, but the striking impression of the form fixed in paint. As he steps closer, his shadow falls across the image, and in that shadow lies the truth of what her likeness had already become. The symbol begins there, in the space between the viewer and the viewed, in the interpretation that grows as soon as eyes meet the painted surface. For Eugenia, the object that came to define her was not one she created. It was created around her, over her, through her. The portrait was meant to capture the reality of her appearance, yet it did much more than that. It shaped the world's understanding of her. It transformed her body into metaphor, her presence into spectacle, her complexity into a single, immovable symbol. In the first portrait, she stands wrapped in fine garments, her form emphasized by fabric chosen not to honor her but to highlight the very features that drew the court's attention. The details are meticulous, from the folds of the cloth to the weight it carries on her frame. Her eyes, though fixed as the painter chose to fix them, seem to hold a distant awareness, a softness that contradicts the harshness of the world that surrounded her. This contradiction would become the silent core of her symbolic meaning, the tension between what she was and what she represented. The second portrait, the theatrical costume, deepened this transformation. The clothing was ornate, constructed to delight the eye and amplify the unusual nature of her form. The court intended it to be a display, an embodiment of rarity that pushed her further into the realm of curiosity. Yet the more elaborate the costume, the deeper the child disappeared beneath it. Symbols have a way of overtaking the people they reflect. In the process of turning her into an emblem of the extraordinary, the court had obscured her humanity. And yet it is within this obscurity that the symbol gained its strange power. To those who gazed upon the paintings, especially in the centuries that followed, she became a figure through which society projected its understanding of difference, of beauty, of fear, of fascination. She became the embodiment of a question the world could not fully articulate. What does it mean to exist outside the boundaries of what is familiar? Objects placed upon her in the portrait, the garments, the decorative elements, even the colors chosen by the painter, all contributed to this symbolic core. They were not ornaments, they were interpretations. They were deliberate choices meant to communicate something beyond the child herself. Even the light in the painting, soft yet revealing, shaped the narrative. It cast her not as tragic, not as monstrous, but as inexplicably present, a being neither fully accepted nor entirely rejected, suspended in a realm between spectacle and innocence. Across time, viewers encountered her with varying reactions. Some saw in her a subject of medical curiosity, others perceived her as an emblem of the court's fascination with the unusual. Still, others found in her eyes a quiet dignity, a depth uncorrupted by the intentions of those who framed her. But the truth is that the symbol belonged not to her voice but to the world that had built it. And yet symbols, however imposed, can carry unexpected meanings. The image of Eugenia stills the viewer, invites contemplation, asks without words what lies behind the surface of human difference. It becomes a mirror that reflects not her inner self, but the inner selves of those who look upon her. This is the paradox of her symbol. It obscures her while revealing the world. In the centuries that followed, the portraits survived wars, displacements, and the slow erosion of memory. They remained intact, even as the details of her life faded into silence. The symbol endured because symbols rarely depend on the stories of the individuals they portray. They survive on the power of interpretation, on the persistence of the questions they evoke. And so the image of the girl, dressed in fabric heavier than her childhood, became more than a depiction. It became an artifact of how societies confront the unfamiliar. It became a testament to the way appearance can overshadow identity. It became a silent message across time, whispering that the surface is never the whole. Now, as we stand before this symbol, the light in the imagined studio begins to dim. The ornate fabric in the portrait softens in the fading glow, losing its sharpness, becoming almost ghost-like. The edges blur, the colors deepen into shadow, and the figure retreats once more into the stillness of paint and canvas. The child behind the symbol cannot be reached. But the symbol continues to speak, its meaning shifting with each generation that confronts it. The light falls lower, silence gathers, and as the last traces of illumination slip away from the painted fabric, a single detail remains visible at the very edge of darkness, a lingering glimmer on the threadwork of her costume. It is that glimmer, faint and flickering, that will lead us into the next part of her story, where we follow the slow turning of her life as time begins to move her through its inevitable stages. The faint glimmer on the threadwork lingers as though it were the final particle of light, refusing to yield to the darkness gathering around the portrait. It flickers softly, not bright enough to illuminate the room, but steady enough to remind us that even in the stillness of paint and memory, something of a life remains. That single glint becomes the entryway into the shifting arc of her existence, the stages of life that unfolded beyond the confines of the studio, beyond the eyes of the painter, beyond the moment when her likeness was fixed in time. For while the world would come to know her through images that do not age, Eugenia herself continued to move through years that did not stand still for her. Life, indifferent to the court's fascination, continued its quiet procession. After the portraits were completed, the intensity of attention that had surrounded her began to ease. Curiosity, no matter how fervent, rarely holds indefinitely in the courtly world where novelty is constantly replaced by new preoccupations. The same nobles who once crowded around her image drifted toward other diversions. The murmuring that once followed her steps softened into something more like background noise, a distant echo rather than a constant presence. In this loosening of attention, she entered the next stage of her life. She was no longer the child freshly arrived from the mountains, nor the girl whose portrait commanded the gaze of the palace. She became instead a quiet figure woven into the routine of court life, present but fading into the periphery. Her days unfolded in slow patterns, shaped by the rhythms of a household that was not truly her own. She grew, as all children do. Her body changed in ways the court could not fully interpret. The condition that had made her so unusual in infancy persisted, shaping her appearance as she moved from childhood toward adolescence. Yet these transformations were recorded by no one. We know nothing of her voice at this age, nothing of her laughter, nothing of the small gestures that reveal the contours of a growing self. History rarely preserves the inner lives of those it deems peripheral. Still, we can sense the atmosphere in which she lived. The palace, with its long hallways and echoing chambers, was a place where time itself seemed to walk in measured steps. In such a world, a child who was no longer new and no longer a spectacle might find herself drifting into stillness, unnoticed except by the attendants tasked with her care. Perhaps she walked the shaded courtyards in early morning when the stones were cool beneath her feet. Perhaps she watched the carriages pull in from distant provinces, listening to the sounds of wheels and hoofbeats rolling through the gate. Perhaps she found familiarity in the small routines that occupy the servants, routines she could observe but never join. These possibilities, though unrecorded, give shape to the silence surrounding her adolescence. And as the years passed, the court itself shifted like a great structure settling under its own weight. Spain was changing. The reign of Charles II, marked by frailty and uncertainty, approached its final chapters. The tensions of succession, the slow fraying of imperial strength, and the undercurrent of religious interpretation cast new shadows over daily life. These broader movements formed the backdrop of Eugenia's existence, though she played no part in them. She lived within the palace but remained apart from its political and social concerns, a life unfolding quietly in the margins. In this stage, her identity began to fade from the written record. It is not that she ceased to exist, but rather that she no longer fit the categories that compelled chroniclers to take note. She was not a figure of influence, not a member of the nobility, not a participant in court intrigue. She had fulfilled her brief purpose as a curiosity, and once that purpose passed, the world of documentation lost sight of her. Yet the body that had drawn so much attention in her early years continued its own inward struggle. Medical understanding at the time was limited, and whatever condition shaped her form likely placed strain on her health as she grew older. The absence of record suggests a gradual withdrawal, a life lived increasingly away from the central spaces of the court. The stages of her life moved more swiftly now, not because time accelerated but because its traces grew fainter. A child who had once stood at the center of royal attention now became a young woman whose presence went largely unremarked. And yet, it is in this quiet obscurity that the truth of her existence becomes more human. Without the eyes of the court fixed upon her, she could simply live whatever life remained to her, shaped not by spectacle, but by the ordinary details of days unfolding without fanfare. The transitions of youth, the settling into adolescence, the first signs of decline, all these passed over her with no commentary, no narratives, no recorded interpretations. She became, for the first time, simply herself, though the world would never know what that self contained. Time moves onward, always, and as it moves, certain doors begin to close. At some point, though the exact moment is lost, Eugenia disappeared from the palace registers. Whether she left or was moved to a quieter residence, whether her health faltered or her role diminished, the silence surrounding her grows deeper. What remains is not absence but mystery, the same mystery that surrounded her birth, her childhood, and her transformation into symbol. The final stages of her life, unrecorded, become a shadow that stretches across the years that followed. Behind it lies a life that continued in its own small rhythms, a life that changed and aged even as the portraits preserved her as eternally young. And as we follow her into this dimming stage, the last sound that lingers is the soft closing of a distant door, its echo faint yet distinct, as though marking the passage from one room of existence into another. It is that closing door, quiet but unmistakable, that leads us onward, preparing us to explore the fragile philosophy that emerges from her story and the figure who would carry that philosophy into remembrance long after her footsteps faded from the palace floors. The quiet echo of the closing door remains suspended in the air, a soft vibration that seems to linger long after the sound itself has faded. It hangs there almost weightlessly, as though uncertain whether it should drift forward into the next moment or settle back into the silence from which it emerged. That lingering echo becomes the threshold into a deeper contemplation of her life, for it invites us to turn from the external circumstances that shaped her existence toward the interior truths that rise when the world's gaze finally recedes. In the hush that follows the closing door, a kind of philosophy begins to take form, not one spoken by Eugenia herself, for no words of hers have survived, but one drawn from the shape of her story, from the spaces where meaning must be gathered rather than given. It is a philosophy rooted in the fragile tension between visibility and invisibility, between being seen and being known. Eugenia's life teaches, without proclamation, that the body can become a container for the world's interpretations, yet remain opaque even to those who fill it with meaning. The court saw her clearly, almost too clearly. It observed every contour of her form with fascination, yet failed to perceive the inner world that moved behind her eyes. From this paradox arises the first thread of her unspoken philosophy, that human beings, no matter how intensely examined, remain mysteries that no amount of observation can fully resolve. This truth stands quietly in the background of her story, waiting for those who look beyond the surface. As the world shifted around her and the intensity of the court's curiosity diminished, this truth became more pronounced. Without the noise of constant attention, her existence found space to settle into something more inward, more private, even if that privacy was shaped by circumstance rather than choice. The silence surrounding her later years is not an emptiness but a presence, the presence of a life lived without the weight of the gaze that once defined it. It is in this silence that a guardian begins to emerge, not necessarily a single individual but a composite figure shaped by all who preserved even the faintest trace of her. A guardian need not be someone who knew her intimately. It can be the painter whose brush captured her likeness with unexpected dignity, or the chronicler whose brief mention ensured she was not completely forgotten, or even the modern historian who pauses before her portrait and wonders who she truly was beneath the layers of interpretation. These guardians form a chain across centuries, a fragile but unbroken line of remembrance. They stand not as protectors of her body, which time inevitably claimed, but as protectors of her story, ensuring that she did not vanish entirely from the human record. Among them, the painter Juan Carreño de Miranda holds a unique place. Though he worked within the expectations of the court, the sensitivity in his portrait suggests that he perceived something more than the surface he was asked to depict. In the subtlety of her expression, in the careful rendering of her face, there is a trace of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of her humanity. His art became the vessel through which her existence traveled across time, a vessel that carried her through the centuries with a dignity that her circumstances did not always afford. Another guardian is the anonymous scribe who documented her presence, not with flourish or pity, but with a sparse factual tone that reveals more than it says. By writing her name, by recording even the minimal details of her condition and her place in the court, he resisted the complete erasure that so many lives suffered. And then there are those who came later, long after her death, individuals who stood before her portrait in museums or archives and felt compelled to ask who she was. Their questions, though unanswerable, formed a protective circle around her memory, keeping her alive not as a curiosity, but as a person whose story deserved contemplation. This constellation of guardians reveals another dimension of her unspoken philosophy: that remembrance is never accidental. It is shaped by the choices of those who refuse to let the forgotten disappear entirely. It is sustained by people who find meaning not in the certainty of answers, but in the persistence of questions. Through these guardians, her life whispers a final lesson that even those who lived at the margins of history can influence the moral compass of those who come after. Eugenia's story does not point toward triumph or tragedy. It points toward understanding, toward the recognition that every life, no matter how obscured, contains a depth that deserves to be honored. Her philosophy, emerging quietly through the fragments of her existence, teaches humility in the face of difference, compassion in the presence of the unfamiliar, and patience with the mysteries we cannot unravel. And yet, as we move through the space of this philosophy, the echo of the closing door returns, softer now, as though it were receding down a hallway we cannot see. The sound fades into the stillness, leaving behind a sense of passage, of something drawing to an end. For every philosophy has its limit. Every guardian eventually steps back, and every life arrives at its final threshold. In the silence that follows, the question of her ending begins to gather like a distant shadow approaching slowly, almost imperceptibly, across the floor of time. It is toward that shadow, that final moment in which her presence slips from the world into memory, that we now turn, guided by the faint, diminishing echo of the door that has closed behind her. The faint, diminishing echo of the door that closed behind her seems to travel down a corridor we cannot fully see, growing softer until it dissolves into a silence so complete that it feels almost fragile. It is within this silence that we must confront the final passage of her life, for the end that awaited Eugenia did not arrive with spectacle or proclamation. It came quietly, in the same muted tones that had shaped her existence after the court's curiosity faded. There are no records that tell us where she stood in her last days, no documents that mark the precise moment when youth gave way to frailty, no testimonies to describe who, if anyone, remained by her side. Yet the absence of detail is not emptiness. It is an invitation to understand the nature of lives that history observes only in fragments. What we do know is that Eugenia did not grow old. Her condition, whatever its medical name might be in modern terms, likely imposed burdens on her body that became heavier with time. The strain that once made her an object of fascination in childhood may have turned into suffering as she entered her later years. Without the care she might have needed, in a world without the knowledge or tools to ease such burdens, her life would have narrowed gradually, becoming quieter, slower, more inward. We can imagine her in a room far from the ceremonial spaces of the palace, a room where light entered through a small window and the sounds of courtly life drifted in only faintly, if at all. The grandeur that once framed her in portraiture would have felt distant, belonging to a different world. Her days might have passed in stillness, the rhythm of her breath marking the passage of time more reliably than any clock. And then, at some moment lost to history, that breath would have slowed, weakened, and ceased altogether. The silence that followed would have been immediate and complete, the kind that falls when something delicate passes from presence into absence. There was no recorded vigil, no chronicler waiting to document her final hour. Her death was not an event, it was a vanishing. She slipped away from the world in the same manner she had lived within it, seen yet unseen, present yet uncomprehended. The last word she left behind was not spoken, for no witness preserved her final breath in writing. Instead, the last word becomes the silence itself, a silence that enfolds her story like a shroud, concealing the details but revealing the profound truth embedded in the quiet, that her life, though brief and sparsely recorded, carried meaning not through what was said but through what remains unsaid. In that silence lies the echo of a question that has followed her through time. What does it mean for a life to be remembered without being known? The world preserved her image but lost her voice. It documented her presence but forgot her experience. It captured her form in paint but let her humanity fade into obscurity. And so the last word is a paradox absence that speaks. quiet that resonates, mystery that refuses to close. We stand before this silence not to fill it, for that would be an intrusion, but to acknowledge its power. It reminds us that history, for all its records and chronicles, often holds the delicate lives of the unknown more loosely than it holds the grand narratives of kings and nations. Yet there is a solemn dignity in that loosening, for it allows a life like Eugenia's to drift beyond the confines of what others expected her to be. The child whose portraits once stirred curiosity has become in death a figure shaped not by spectacle, but by reflection. Her last word, if it can be called a word, is the space she leaves behind for contemplation, the stillness that invites us to listen not for sound but for meaning. As the silence deepens, it does not feel empty. It feels like a threshold, and thresholds are never final. They open as much as they close. And so, in the quiet after her passing, something else begins to stir. It is faint, barely perceptible at first, like a distant shift in the air. It is the sense that her story has not truly ended, that death has not sealed it but transformed it into something that will move forward differently, carried by those who encounter her in the only form that survived. That faint stirring is where the next part of her story begins, in the space between death and remembrance, where legacy takes shape. It rises softly from the stillness, guiding us toward the long echo her life cast far beyond the short span of her years. From the stillness that followed her passing, something begins to rise, not a sound, not a motion, but a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as though the air itself carries the faint memory of her existence forward. This quiet stirring becomes the threshold into the realm of legacy, the space where a life once lived in obscurity begins to cast a shadow far longer than the span of its years. Legacy does not always grow from achievement or intention. Sometimes it emerges from the persistence of a single image, a single question, a single unresolved detail that refuses to fade. For Eugenia, whose voice left no echo and whose steps left no recorded trail, legacy took the form of the portraits that survived her, those silent witnesses that preserved her presence even as the world around them changed beyond recognition. After her death, her name slipped quickly from the conversations of her time. She was never a figure of political consequence, never a symbol of reform or resistance, never someone whose deeds demanded preservation. And yet the paintings remained. They endured wars, migrations, changing tastes, shifting powers. They were moved, stored, catalogued, sometimes forgotten, then found again by wandering eyes that paused before them, not out of obligation but out of a quiet, persistent curiosity. In those moments, her legacy began to form, not as a coherent narrative but as an impression, a question that tugged softly at the conscience of whoever stood before her image. Who was this child, preserved in such careful detail, yet missing from the broader story of her age? What life did she live beyond the frame? What thoughts lay behind the expression the painter chose to give her? And why did history, with all its hunger for detail, leave her so silent? These questions, unanswerable yet enduring, became the foundation of her legacy. They invited reflection rather than conclusion, contemplation rather than certainty. Across generations, scholars, artists, and ordinary visitors found themselves returning to her image, tracing the contours of her form, reading meaning into the soft lines of her face, sensing something beneath the spectacle that her contemporaries had never paused to acknowledge. Her legacy is not the legacy of influence, it is the legacy of presence. A presence that outlasted her life because it resisted easy interpretation. A presence that challenged the assumptions of those who gazed upon her, both in her time and in ours. In this way, Eugenia became an enduring reminder of the delicate boundary between the known and the unknowable. She became a lens through which viewers confronted their own understanding of difference, of beauty, of humanity. The very thing that once made her a curiosity became, in time, a point of reflection about the nature of perception itself. As centuries passed and historical study deepened, her image found new meaning in the fields of art history, medicine, anthropology, and the philosophy of representation. She became not a symbol of anomaly but a symbol of how societies treat those whose bodies do not conform to expectation. Indeed, her legacy lies not in what she intended, for she could not have intended any of this, but in what she reveals about us, the viewers, the interpreters, the inheritors of her image. Her silence became a mirror. Her stillness became a question. Her absence became a space in which modern observers could examine their own assumptions and biases. And still, beneath all these interpretations, the portrait retains an unbroken, quiet. It does not insist. It does not argue. It does not explain. It simply remains, offering the same enigmatic presence that once confounded the court. It invites us to step closer, to look longer, to acknowledge the humanity that her contemporaries overlooked. This is the power of her legacy. It is subtle, persistent, and deeply human. It grows not from words but from the absence of them. It flows not from action but from endurance. It survives because the mystery at its center is not one that time can erode. As we reflect upon this, the air around the portrait seems to settle into a calm that feels almost like closure. Yet closure is not the nature of stories like hers. They do not end so much as fade gently into the background of our understanding, leaving behind a faint impression that lingers long after the details diminish. And so we return once more to the quiet stirring that began this final movement. It echoes softly now, like a breath passing through a darkened gallery, reminding us that legacy is not a conclusion but a continuation. It is the ongoing life of a story shaped not by what was known, but by what remains to be discovered. Eugenia Martínez, the girl who was seen but never known, endures not because her life was celebrated, but because her existence continues to invite compassion, curiosity, and contemplation. She lives in the questions we ask, in the reflections her image inspires, in the delicate space where history and human empathy meet. And as the stirring fades into the soft twilight of remembrance, the story settles into its final stillness, leaving us with the quiet understanding that some lives, however briefly illuminated, cast a light that reaches far beyond their time.